Hello, welcome to the Art of Costume Podcast. I'm Elizabeth Joy Glass.
And I'm Spencer Williams.
How's spooky season treating ya?
Oh, it's going good. Lots of preparation. You know, we have lots of great stuff coming this month. Lots of spooky things. So behind the scenes, Elizabeth and I have been working on spooky witch sessions.
And what exactly were the Puritans up to?
What? That is the theme. We said this month is called the season of the witch, but really it's called What the Hell Were the Puritans Up To? And it really starts with this film that we're about to get into, a film that okay, let's put this to bed. I've brought this up before on several podcasts now. I swore that Elizabeth and I and our friend Avija went to the theaters and saw The Witch together. Elizabeth, now that you have seen it again, am I wrong?
My very first viewing of The Witch was last night in my bed. I do remember you wanting us all to go see it. And I don't remember why I didn't go see it, but I was like, no. And I didn't.
I will actually take this as a L then, and I believe you. But
thank you.
We sat down, we watched it, and now here we are. Yeah. So I believe you. But before we do, we actually have an incredible guest waiting for us. So let's not waste any time. I'm very excited for this conversation. Why don't I start us off with a summary?
Please.
Well, this week we are watching The Witch, which was directed by Robert Eggers, someone who is actually a fan favorite at this podcast, as it seems.
Yes.
In 1630 New England, panic and despair envelops a farmer, his wife, and their children when youngest son Samuel suddenly vanishes. The family blames Thomasin, the oldest daughter who was watching the boy at the time of his disappearance. With suspicion and paranoia mounting, twin siblings Mercy and Jonas suspect Thomasin of witchcraft, testing the clan's faith, loyalty, and love to one another. And that is The Witch.
You haven't seen The Witch? Go watch it. It's a good one.
That's fun. You won't regret it. It's spooky.
No, you won't.
It's artsy. It's deep. It's all the things.
And one of the things it definitely is a film filled with incredible costumes. So let's meet our costume designer, Linda Muir. You will know Linda's work from The Lighthouse, The Northman, which we did an episode on about a year and a half, 2 years ago.
That was a good one.
It was a great one. And you will probably know one of her other films as well, because Linda has been in the industry since 1987 and has a long resume of excellent work to her name, including her upcoming film, Nosferatu, coming out December 25th.
I can't wait for that. I mean, sounds like Bill Skarsgård is playing a titular character, so we all know that's going to be a banger. Well, Elizabeth, I'm very excited to say that costume designer Linda Muir is here with us. I'm so excited. I feel like, it's been a little while since this film came out, and it was such a fun rewatch, and we just have lots of questions. So
absolutely.
On the other end of this break, we're going to talk to the one, the only costume designer, Linda Muir.
Hi, I'm Dan, who does all the magic behind the scenes. I wanted to say thank you, and if you want to support the show even farther, go to tpublic.com/user/theartofcostume, where you can buy a couple variations of our logo on t-shirts, mugs, and stickers. Also, be sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and if you're an audio listener, leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast. Now, back to the show.
All right, costume nerds, I am so excited to welcome our first guest of the season of The Witch, the one and only costume designer, Linda Muir. Hi, Linda. How are you?
Hello, Spencer. Hello, Elizabeth. I'm doing very well, thank you.
Yeah, we're so excited to talk to you. I'm such a big fan of The Witch. But before we get into the film, I actually want to talk to you about working with Robert Eggers, the director. The Witch was actually his first feature film, and I found it really amazing. I can't think of another costume designer who's done with this. You've worked with Robert on all of his films going forward, all his feature films, The Witch, The Lighthouse, The Northman, for which Elizabeth and I actually did a podcast episode about, and the upcoming Nosferatu, which I'm very excited for. So what is it about your collaboration that contributes to the success of each project, and how has your working relationship evolved over the years?
Initially, and yes, this was Robert's first film. He had been working on trying to have it produced for, I think, about 4 or 5 years prior to the production coming to Canada, which is where I met Robert in Toronto. He's very careful about interviewing. I interviewed with him twice. And I think it was perhaps the fact that both of us, both Robert and I, have a background in theater that maybe, was one of the elements that he felt really comfortable with. All of his collaborators, actually, Craig Lathrop, Jaron, his DP, Louise Ford, his editor, and I think probably from The Northman onward, his continuity person, Julia, we've all sort of become a family of sorts. And I think often about, why is it that when Robert and I work together, it's so much fun and it's so satisfying. And, aside from the fact that he, as a director, writer, really does protect his collaborators, he guards against, sort of rash decisions or cuts that are unnecessary, or, including things that aren't, that are going to cost too much and that will take away from production values in other areas. But in addition to all of that, I think that one thing that I am aware, the expression "a labor of love," comes up frequently in discussing, my working relationship with Robert. And it's not simply the human being, Robert, who is lovely. It's also the things that we love, the things that we respect. And he has a devotion to research. He has a notion about authenticity. And those are things that I hold very near and dear to me. And I think we both feel that in the case of scripts, fiction, that is, the stories are so outlandish, particularly Nosferatu, for instance, and The Witch also, when the visuals are grounded in authentic looking sets, costumes, props, then for both he and I, and I think his other collaborators, the experience seems to be much more frightening than if what you're looking at in terms of sets and costumes are imaginary, and there's a place for that, for sure, in costume design. But that, I think, is one of the satisfying aspects of working with Robert, that he appreciates that and understands it, he gets it.
I love that.
I mean, clearly between the two of you, there's a huge, love for the details, which, we've talked about quite a bit on this podcast, especially The Northman. I know Elizabeth and I were really in love with that film, and all the small little details that you could see that, only had close-ups for a minute, like the Bjork character. I remember us talking about that look so much. And The Witch, I mean, it's just chock full of detail.
You clearly really got into your research with the story taking place in the 1630s. It's only seconds in the film, and you can just see the research right there for The Witch, including silhouettes, fabrics, the historical details. Can you talk about the research process and how it influenced your costume design choices?
Yes, absolutely. I think that with each film, the beginning of prep, actually a good portion of prep, is all about the research. It's about asking questions. It's about asking Robert, why this? Why that? One book, one article will lead to another, And the deeper I get into the research, the more I discover. And, then we start to have this kind of exciting back and forth. I remember, for instance, in researching The Witch, there was a couple of really interesting things that popped up. But one was the use of baptismal cloths at the period, and they were often red, and particularly for families that could afford it. And so that was one of the things that I said to Robert. Our palette is so soft and natural and organic, and that was definitely what he was striving for, with pops of red that were indicators, placeholders. This is, kind of a pointing toward what's coming further down the road, like the witch. And the spot that ended up being appropriate for was in the raven scene, where the raven is supposed to be Samuel, and Catherine is holding what she believes is Samuel, when in fact it's a raven pecking at her breast. And so, the blood of the breast, the just the red color and kind of indicating the witch that we've seen running through the woods, and beckoning Caleb, I think, at that point. The research kind of offers these sorts of tidbits, and you make notes of them, you think of them, they go into your imagination. So, getting back to the beginning of prep, I think it's really important, at least for me, to read and to look at as many images as possible. In the case of the witch, it was woodcuts, statues, paintings. There really obviously weren't any photographs or anything, kind of detailed. And put as much into my mind and heart and imagination, and then confer with Robert, who also has spent, he for each of the projects does a huge amount of research, and he uses that to inform his writing, in the script. So, we kind of then start to pick through what different things can we apply to each of the characters, in terms of clothing, that will differentiate each character, one from another. Color, texture, that comes in later. Usually I sketch in pencil, and then I do watercolors when I know what I'm thinking is kind of appropriate.
Getting into the color a little bit more, as you said, the film uses color very sparingly and purposefully. How did that work with the overall muted color palette, and what inspired the different choices of colors you decided to use?
Well, at the period, there were no, there were only plant-based dyes. So it's seeds, leaves, nuts, bark, whatever. And each of those plants render, either alone or in combination, a really muted. It takes a lot of dye. It takes a lot of plant material to achieve, rich, full colors. Mm-hmm. And, you might see that with royalty, or you might see that with a much more elevated, family. And also plant-based dyes fade in sunlight, even when they're fixed. And so a combination of not being able to achieve a really deep color initially, except the red, which is, meant to be a little fantastical anyway. It's not meant to be realistic. So that is kind of the starting point. And also, I think that I remember being quite surprised. It's sort of similar, actually, to, we always imagine Greek, like the Parthenon, and we imagine Greek buildings being the stark white marble, when in fact they were, in reality, very colorful.
Yeah.
And it's similar with Puritan clothing, I think, perhaps because of black and white etchings, and because of maybe film and theater renderings, like The Crucible or whatever. We tend to think of without doing much research, we tend to think of Puritans as being very somber, very black, white details, white collars, coifs, that sort of thing. But in fact, they were, fairly colorful. And early on in the prep process, I went to Plymouth Plantation with Robert and our production designer, Craig Lathrop. And at Plymouth Plantation, which is just south of Plymouth Rock, and if if you've not been, it's really fascinating because it is in the summertime. I think spring through fall, there are reenactors that, and actually I was in the prep period of The Witch and also The Northman. Hats off to reenactors. Some of them are extraordinary in the
Right.
lengths that they go to, in recreating these things. But at Plymouth Plantation, there was a wonderful woman, Denise Lepica, I think her name was, and she is in charge of, or was in charge, I have no idea if she's still there, but she was in charge of all of the costuming for the reenactors. I don't think they're called reenactors, though. I think they're called something else there. But anyway, and I was fascinated just by how cheerful, a lot of the clothing was when you sort of think of their lifestyle and everything that they had given up in most cases if they are separatists and they moved from, England to frontier America. It's pretty crazy. So, the color choices were based on reality, based on what was at hand. And then in terms of fabrics, cotton wasn't a thing at the period. So everything is either linen or wool. And what was really fabulous and fascinating was on set, with all of the actors dressed in their many, many layers of linen and wool, we'd run in with snow goose parkas and say, would you like your parka? And they're, no, toasty, I'm great. And meanwhile the crew is, sort of shivering in early spring weather.
They're like, Linda, we're wearing 100 layers as these Puritan children.
Exactly.
That's so funny. And that really kind of blew my mind that, these plant dyes, it's not what we think of today. I mean, it's almost like from these dyes, they're getting the essence of color throughout their costumes.
Yes, and to be clear, I'm not saying that the costumes in The Witch are plant dyed. I found fabrics that replicated. We certainly did not have the budget to start with a blank canvas. That certainly has been the case since The Witch. Each of the budgets of each of the films that Robert has done subsequently have been, tenable.
Yeah.
The Witch project was minuscule.
Yeah. Selling corn and stuff to get costume budget.
Exactly. So, it's not that what you see on the screen are plant-based dyed fabrics, but they replicate that, or they're natural, they're wool or linen that is undyed. And that was a huge thing too. So,
right.
And always, working, I start when I'm in prep with the script, and I do massive charts. The Northman, I think it was 8 feet long and 4 feet wide.
Oof.
The Witch was probably about the same. And each of the scenes is I draw it up like a grid. And the scenes go along the bottom and the characters go along the side. And then, at any point in the script, I can move my 2 fingers together and see who's in that scene. What have they been wearing up to that point? What is the temperature of the overall script at this point? What's the direction that we're going in? What do I want to kind of accent? What do I want to bring along? What do I want to suppress? So it's not simply, doing sketches and then creating costumes and then that's it. There's a lot of thought that goes into and a lot of questions with Robert, and he's thought these things through. And if he hasn't, he takes the time to really think it through and think about, what are the ramifications of this choice or that choice.
Yeah, we're definitely going to come back to this topic too when we talk about continuity and the aging and dying, which I'm very excited to talk about. But first, I think we need to talk about one of our stars, Miss Anya Taylor-Joy, who this was her first major motion picture, which is pretty crazy. So before we get into Thomason, working with the young actress, did you must have known she was going to be this huge star one day. She's now in everything.
Well, I'd be lying if I said, yes, it was absolutely clear that, she'd be a mega star. She's fabulous.
Right.
She was a very successful young model at the time. And so she certainly, was aware of, the effect on camera, which was great. is a very well, upsetting is minimal, emotional ride that she was on for this film. And given that she was so young and not experienced in film acting, she was extraordinary. I
Yeah.
mean, she's lovely. She continued to be lovely in each film. In The Northman, conditions on The Northman were really harsh, and conditions on The Witch were really harsh. And I mean, she just is as they say, a trooper.
Yeah, I can't imagine the emotional toll these films took on, her and also the crew and you. I mean, I have to imagine it was very cold.
Yeah, I've had this experience with each of Robert's films in different ways. And, you're standing on set, and for whatever combination of magical reasons, it's like being hauled back in time. And on The Witch, I remember very clearly inside the homestead, inside the home, standing. Obviously, it was very small, and as few crew as possible. And it was the dinner scene at the table with William with his napkin over his shoulder, and each of them passing out what little scrap of rotten bread they had. And I remember being, just sort of back up against one of the walls, and it was late spring in Ontario, so north of Toronto, so there was still snow along the tree lines, and they had a lot of night shooting, and so it was not warm. And I remember thinking, how did anyone survive? How really did anyone survive?
Right.
Given how much you need to know.
Yeah, I mean, just the harsh environment. I mean, Elizabeth and I, this entire month we're doing episodes about, witches and Puritan cultures, and we were just having a conversation behind the scenes. We're like, I don't know how anyone did this, because it's just like, I just can't imagine.
It's all in the end so special that you just kind of go, whatever. It's part of the deal.
Yeah, it's part of the deal. Maybe we could suggest on this podcast, hey Robert, maybe the next one we could do like one in Hawaii, and then we could get back to like the dark villages and the forest, because Nosferatu doesn't look very warm either, but that's neither here nor there. But what was a little warm actually was Thomason's pink hue to her costumes, and I just seeing it every time, it's very subtle, but I couldn't help but thinking, maybe it symbolized something a little bit deeper, perhaps, or innocence, or maybe a connection to something a little bit more sinister. I could tell that you were kind of giving us a little bit of a sign with that pink hue.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this predates Pink is for Girls, Blue is for Boys.
Right.
So I felt, safe in that realm. I think that it definitely has a blush. It has a youth. It has a naivete. And it also, pink, can quite easily become red.
That's a good one.
So that's definitely there in the, thought process.
I didn't even think of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was really, really cute, but now that you say it, it is kind of just showing like this slow transition into madness, especially when we see her covered in blood, and then,
Yeah.
Whew, that's a good one. I never thought of that one.
Well, in our research of The Witch, we learned that at least at one point you considered William's leather jerkin to be one of your favorite costumes. And I have to say, it is pretty spectacular.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very special piece. He doesn't wear it, necessarily throughout the whole film. It's sort of, it isn't used in specific scenes for specific reasons.
Mm-hmm.
I think also maybe that was a preference early on. I think now when I look at the sketches and when I look at the film and when I think about the characters, I think I'm perhaps more drawn to Catherine and Caleb.
Oh.
Oddly enough. Yeah.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
it changes.
10 years later.
We'll check in with you in another 10 and see, maybe it'll be the witch costume, you know?
It's not to say that, it's not to say that I don't love the jerkin. I do, but, it could also be influenced by the divine Kate Dickey. I've worked with her since The Witch, also on The Northman, and she is just truly such a spectacular actress. I don't know, maybe that's influenced it. And Caleb, I really like the character, and Harvey was pretty great. So.
Well, before we get into the twins, which I'm going to touch on in a minute, do you feel like the cast was pretty collaborative in a costume process, or were you kind of feeling like, explain to them, like, this is what you would typically wear? Like, what did that process look like?
Well, the entire cast came from the UK, and with the exception of Black Phillip and the people from the Meeting House, but they, and I prepped in Toronto because I wanted to use the cutter and seamstresses that I am familiar with, who trust and have a long-standing working relationship with. But the film was being prepped in about 5 hours north of Toronto, and so Robert and I did a lot of Skype calls. And when Robert was still doing casting in the UK, we would do Skype calls from the UK. I'd get him to go to one costume house or another, and I'd say, have a look at this, have a look at that, and we would agree that it wasn't appropriate and we'd have to make it. And certainly on The Northman, for instance, or Nosferatu, there was much more ongoing production of costumes. And so the actors were, I drew them in the process much more because they were present.
Yeah.
But with The Witch, because of the budget and because of the story, Robert and I made a decision very early on that each of the characters would really have one basic costume, and then with add-ons like coats or capes or jerkins or whatever. And so, there wasn't really the same kind of need for the actor involvement in that, you're going to change your costume now because of this reason, or
right.
And also the distance. And because it was a short prep period, I had conversations via email with Anya and with Kate and Ralph, because they were all established, kind of more mature actors, not with Lucas and Ellie's parents or with Harvey. They didn't really know anything until they arrived. And we did the fittings in Toronto. Robert was still in Mattawa, north of Toronto. So we did Skype check-ins and tons of photographs. That certainly wasn't the case with any of the other films. I continue with The Lighthouse. I prepped in Toronto, but Robert came for the fittings. And for The Northman, we were all together in Belfast. So, ongoing fit, and there were many, 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 many costumes. I think of Nicole, I did a whole kind of spread for her. So, it depends on the film, but for The Witch, it was much more the actors arrive, give them the download of period. And Robert also was having throughout, lengthy conversations, either in person or on the phone or email with the adult actors. So there was never the feeling that they were being forced to wear something that was inappropriate. I think, au contraire, they felt transformed. Certainly, the first fittings were not as finished as when they arrived on set, and then they were finished and they were aged and distressed, and there was a definite, oh my God, this feels fabulous. To be on the farm and to be in these costumes and to see the animals and everything else. It was magical.
Sounds like between you and Robert, you guys tend to keep each other busy on these projects. He's going to costume houses. You're making big old scripts and whatnot. It sounds like a lot of work. Speaking of a lot of work, we have to talk about the twins, Jonas and Mercy. So while they are adorable, Elizabeth and I were texting while watching this, so we both agreed We don't get how William and Kate continue to have more kids after these two. Because they're so crazy. But that being said, I was watching the Blu-ray bonus features, and these are two very professional young actors at the time. So I have to give them their props. So what was it like? You kind of touched on it a little bit, but designing costumes for these two very young actors at the time. It sounds like you're working with parents and whatnot.
Yeah.
Just curious on how that looked.
Yeah, they weren't really involved in the design process, but certainly the fitting process was novel.
Mm-hmm.
I remember Lucas was crawling around acting like Black Phillip, and Ellie, I think, at one point joined him. And then I thought, okay, so I'm a parent, what would I do? So I kind of picked up Lucas, and I said, Lucas, you're a mannequin. You don't move until I tell you you can move. And he totally played along, and he was like a little mannequin, and we did the fitting. And then he continued to be, back on his hands and knees as, the goat.
Oh,
so,
man.
Yeah, it could be a little intense, but, they were amazing. And Robert consciously protected them from what the storyline realities were. They didn't know that they were, taken away by a witch and pummeled into some kind of body.
I'm still trying to figure that out.
But the sketches were all up in the costume truck, and so when they'd come clambering up the steps, and Holly, what are you doing? And they'd go to the back of the truck and see these pictures of sketches of the witches and all of the reference material. We'd have to kind of say, "Yeah, isn't that crazy?"
Yeah. Just don't think about it, guys. Watch it in 10 years.
Yeah.
Exactly. But then, Ellie was amazing. She was, very mature for her age. And, they listened to what the direction was, and, they ran with it. So
wow, that's amazing.
And also Ralph and Kate were incredible with them, and Anya, all of the adult actors. And I would say, the adult crew as well were very cognizant of their age and tried not to have them impacted by, some of the darker storylines.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very intimate and close story too. So, I mean, you only have this really core group of actors. Yeah. So they're supporting each other. So that's really good to hear.
Yeah.
Going back a little bit to the very opening scene in the meeting house, there are so many background actors. And how did you approach designing costumes for such a large group? Especially with, you need to reflect the Puritan era's like religious mannerisms.
In terms of the prep, it was really me for most of the prep by myself with Robert elsewhere. And then I had an assistant, Charlene Seniak, who joined me late in prep and concentrated on finding shoes, ordering linen tape. And she also was great in terms of fabricating a lot of the background coifs and aprons and falling bands and collars for the crowd scene in the meeting house. So the meeting house was, a necessary, it made huge demands on the budget because of the numbers. And so there were certain things that Robert and I concentrated on to try and minimize the amount of money that we had to spend on those costumes, so that we couldn't afford to we made everything for the family and for the two witches and for Black Phillip. But the meeting house costumes ended up being rentals from a great costume house in Rome called Tirelli. And they were augmented by a Canadian costume house from Montreal. And then I think we also did hats from someplace else. But we certainly did not have enough budget to do, for instance, footwear for everyone. So we did a kind of, novel experiment where Jaron set up tape lines and we figured out, along with Craig Lathrop, the production designer, what would we actually see in the meeting house. And so we discovered that we actually did not see very many feet. So we did not rent shoes. I did not rent shoes for all of the actors because that would have been problematic anyway, just finding the appropriate silhouette. So,
Yeah.
things like that, decisions like that are very rare. To have that kind of cooperation is very rare. So going from that, which is the most, kind of mundane and boring aspect of costuming, boring in that you have to make that decision. You have to present that decision to a director is not the best scenario, but Robert totally understood. Let's make the best use of our dollars. So, trying to choose silhouettes that would reflect the kinds of people who made the journey. And so, from the rentals, we had the basic costume, and then we made on set while we were filming, because the meeting house we didn't shoot until quite late in the shooting schedule. We made on the costume truck all the linen aprons, coifs that go under the hats for the women, falling bands, so the collars, cuffs that all of the men had and the women. So that's really, I think, what you see is the kind of we made all that element that unifies that group of people. I mean, when I look at it now, I think it's all a little too starched and a little too perfect, but 10 years hindsight.
Yeah.
And sometimes, the appropriate fabulous face, doesn't necessarily come with the body that is one of the costumes that we have. And so, there are lots of ways of having to alter things temporarily. So big crowd scenes that on smaller budgets are challenging. They really are.
One thing from this scene that immediately caught my attention were the hats. And I love a hat. So I loved this opening scene, all the incredible Puritan hats. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of hats in this and how it contributed to the overall feel of the movie?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the best hats we put in the most prominent spots. And I think that William's Sugarloaf, Catherine's Sugarloaf, they were both made for us at Plymouth Plantation. Consequently, or subsequently rather, I have many more contacts, particularly now that I've worked in Europe several times, with incredible milliners, and so I think I would have, if I did the witch now, I think that there would be, I think Thomason's hat would be slightly chunkier, actually a lot chunkier. Those choices were made with what was available at the time, and we couldn't make all the hats, so we made Jonah's hat, and Caleb's Monmouth cap was knit for him. What you maybe don't see, except for maybe in the scenes where Catherine and Thomason are fighting, or William is dragging Thomason across, trying to figure out what the truth is. You would see in scenes like that, they have stockings that are above their knees, like thigh-high hand-knit stockings, which take a phenomenal amount of time to knit. And I was able to buy those secondhand from Plymouth Plantation, which allowed, authenticity on a small budget, But the hats, I think, I'm trying to think of you don't really see Black Phillip's incredible hat. He has a hat with a feather that's, probably about 3 feet long. You see hints of it, but you don't really see the whole piece. I'm trying to think of the other. All the coifs are very specific, and in researching the coifs, that led to a fascinating area of how the hair was dressed. So the hair was dressed with the very long linen tapes, and so the tape was braided into the hair and then brought up either side across the crown, and then the tails of the tapes were then wound back up over the crown. And that whole hair tape, tape being another name for ribbon, so that formed the anchor to secure the coif to. So the coif had its own long linen tapes that then wound back up around in front of that hair mound, And so, we had to manufacture the coifs before even putting on the felt hats or, the straw hats or whatever material, the topper was made of. So all of that was a part of the research process. And, it's so foreign to the way we dress now. It's just fascinating.
Yeah, we really, we talk about this quite a bit, but from a lot of our interviews, we find that, costume designers don't really get to sneak in as many hats as they usually like. So this was kind of like a nice treat for us. And I assume for you too,
Yeah. Well, and I will say that Nosferatu has some pretty spectacular headwear.
Oh, okay, we're gonna revisit that.
It's a little tempting thing there.
Yeah, Christmas Day, by the way, everyone, the perfect holiday film.
Yeah.
Okay, so in The Witch, I just gotta say, aging and dying is one of my favorite aspects of costume design. I could talk about it forever and ever. And what I found so interesting about The Witch is, like you mentioned, they don't really have a lot of costume changes. So these characters really are washing their clothes when they can, or like there's that one moment where poor Thomason has to scrub Williams, whatever he was wearing at that moment.
Brush out his woolens.
Yeah. So I wanted to take this opportunity to talk to you about the aging and dying process, because we also see a lot of dirt, a lot of blood. They're running around in dust. And I mean, it's a mess, a beautiful mess, I should say.
Well, the breakdown process, we didn't have a lot of time. We did the fittings in Toronto, finished sewing all the costumes, and then did breakdown. We did another level of breakdown once we were in Mattawa, and the actors had the costumes for rehearsal for a little bit of time. And so we could individualize spots where their hands would wipe, or, kind of permadirt that was personalized to the size of the body that was inhabiting it. So Robert is fanatical about breakdown, and rightly so, and fabulously so. He doesn't want to see new looking anything. And what that does consequently, because of Jaren's lighting, is it renders texture that, you don't see particularly on set to the naked eye. But then when you watch the film, you think, wow, that read beautifully. It seems like it's been on that body for a very long time. I think that, we spoke earlier about the crew. We had a very tiny crew. So our breakdown was intense. I think we did 3 separate days with maybe 4 people. Wow. And I did breakdown. My assistant did breakdown. We all did breakdown.
We're all doing breakdown. Grab a brush.
We're all doing breakdown. When we got to Mattawa and Kiosk, which was the site where the farm was built, we had some pretty wild makeshift circumstances for costumes that had so much blood involved, and continuity was all over the place. So you're filming something that is bloody in the morning, something that is clean in the afternoon. We did have multiples for certain of the costumes, and I was really careful with Robert going through all of that in prep to decide, how many resets we would need. One thing that is always true, I think, in filming is you could make a huge number of clean costumes for the actors to change into, but you have to have the time to stop the crew, to take the actor away, to clean up not just their costumes, but also clean up their makeup, clean up their hair, clean up the set, everything. So I think that, after a while, experience tells me that we're not going to have time, to reset and reset and reset. So I typically suggest fewer multiples than what one might, think necessary. And so, we were constantly cleaning things, brushing them down. We had on set, really minimal on set washing abilities. We had rudimentary washing abilities. We didn't really have a costume shop to go back to. It was very much nomadic. It was very much like the circus. So we had stages. We had stages of breakdown that we could take farther. And then we had more pristine costumes for instance, like the opening when they first get to the new land that they're going to farm. But again, it wasn't like we had racks and racks of clothing.
Right. I mean, it kind of adds to the realism of it all too, which is what's so terrifying about this movie is just how real it feels at times, except for maybe this next character.
Yes. Getting into the more fantastical element of the witch, the red cloak really stands out with all the muted tones. What was the significance of the color choice of red and the silhouette symbolizing just like her power is so clear?
Yeah. Well, there actually is the old witch who you see naked at the goat, and you see naked in her hovel with poor Samuel. So
not much of a costume there, sadly.
Well, actually, there was a whole costume designed and built, and she did undress completely.
Oh.
But time being of the essence, cut to naked witch slathering herself with Samuel.
Yeah. Oh,
so
dear.
When you see the old witch, it's actually the old witch running through the woods.
Mm-hmm.
You never see her up close in costume, but it's the old witch in costume running through the woods.
Oh.
Or at least another person portraying the old witch. And then in the scene with the young witch, obviously a vision to entice young Caleb. Terrifying old hand, being the old witch in reality.
Yeah, that was a serious jump scare.
Yeah. So, they're all of the fairy tale references, whether it's Little Red Riding Hood or whether it's illustrations, Victorian illustrations or earlier, the definite folktale reference that we have in our subconscious, in the zeitgeist, that was meant to, the red cloak was meant to speak to all of those images, and the rest of our costume is period accurate. It's just that, the red cloak was the kind of lead into the horror.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, Elizabeth and I, we usually do this segment on all these podcasts. Every time we have like a red costume, especially on like a leading female character, we always make a big deal of it. So as soon as I saw this, I was trying not to text Elizabeth being like, we got one. This is a good one.
Well, also this Black Phillip, his cavalier boots, he has red heels.
I saw that.
And the red sole, and he has beautiful gold spurs.
Ooh.
And I don't think you see the boot cuffs, or I think you see maybe a little bit of his gloves, but you don't see the full beaded gloves.
Right.
And the image that I'm looking at on the screen, that was sort of in the makeup trailer. But if you darkened that down to almost black.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. I mean, this is so we're talking about Black Phillip's costume, so everyone listening, and it's one of the most elaborate costumes that I didn't even know existed until I rewatched this film. I forgot that Black Phillip even transformed, so I was already shook. Yes. But it's such an elaborate costume, and you almost barely see it because it's so dark. And I was thinking about you when I saw this scene, because I'm like, Linda made this, and her team, made this very elaborate costume. You barely see it. So, I mean, please, give us the details on this to give it its moment that it so rightfully deserves.
Well, it isn't just Black Phillip's costume. It's the book of names. It's the, everything that scene is meant to evoke. I believe that the realization happened that anything that we show in the full light of day, if it were day, would not be as scary, not be as frightening as what maybe the audience can imagine for themselves. And so the goat shed, which is where, Thomasin wakes up in the house, and then she exits the house and makes her way to the goat shed with her lantern. And Black Phillip, as a goat, is in the goat shed. And finally, she hears what Mercy and Jonas have supposedly been hearing. And Black Phillip is speaking to her, and his voice is just so gorgeous and sexy and deep.
Mm-hmm.
And the goat shed was not a large building.
Mm-hmm.
And the rig that had, I can't even remember how many tea lights on it to create the light from the lantern, and to create, the softness and the twinkle when Thomasin is disrobing and she's just so vulnerable. I believe that, Robert realized that it's more affecting, if it's as realistic as the nightlight, the moonlight, so yes, it can be crushing, but only for a short amount of time,
Yeah.
In subsequent films, Craig and I have both designed either sets or costumes that may or may not end up in the film. And so that, that does happen.
It happens, but we still got a little peek at it, and it was still quite beautiful. Oh my gosh, Linda, that brings us really to the end of The Witch. It's such an incredible film, and we're still talking about this film. What has this film meant to you, looking back on it, that people are still talking about it and having a love for The Witch?
Well, I mean, it's always really gratifying and satisfying to hear that people were moved by the costumes, that the costumes, helped them feel in the period. I think that, obviously it's also the first in a series of other really fabulous Robert Eggers experiences for me. So I hope everyone watches it and enjoys it.
Yeah. And I'm very excited actually for Christmas this year, and probably not for the reason everyone might be thinking, but you and Robert have another film coming out on December 25th, Nosferatu. I know you can't say a lot about it, and we're not going to push for spoilers, but what can we all expect? I am very, very excited for this. The cast looks amazing. The colors, it all just looks great.
Well, the cast is incredible. Lily Rose Depp is extraordinary. Willem Dafoe, Bill Skarsgård is incredible. Nicholas Hoult, Aaron Taylor Johnson. I mean, it goes on. Emma Corrin. I mean, it's just terrifying, beautiful, dark, and I think that's probably about all I can say.
I mean, that's enough for me. That's everything we were hoping for. So, costume designer Linda Muir, thank you so much for talking with us on the Art of Costume podcast. This has been such an honor.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Spencer, and thank you for actually taking such an interest in costuming. It's great.
Elizabeth, it's time for us to play one of our other serious business, not game, serious matters.
Yes.
The Stitch
Very
rating.
serious.
And because I also have questions to you. What did you think?
I liked it.
Okay.
I really liked it. I'm not the biggest fan of silent movies, but this man makes it work.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, the scenes where it was loud, particularly the scenes where the twins were talking.
Oh, man.
I was like, can we go back to the silence? Those child actors were excellent because I was so annoyed.
Oh, yeah. I was like, when Thomasin suddenly was like, you know what? I think those two little kids are the witches. I was on her side. I was like, you know what? let's go.
Yeah, it was so good and not quite what I was expecting.
Mm-hmm.
Because I thought it was all gonna be about Thomasin being a witch and discovering her witchiness, and it's not at all. It is about the wild beliefs of these people.
Yeah, I mean it's that's kind of what's so exciting about the season that we're doing. The craft was a little bit different, but this film and what we're going to be talking about next week, it's really fun to kind of dive back into this period in time because it is so fascinating to me and I love reading about it, but it's just also so horrifying and just these crazy beliefs that led people to believe the darnest things and do the worst things to other humans. I love what Robert Eggers did with this film because it really was like a realistic take on what was actually happening, which was like these young women are being blamed for, you know, the worst fears of these religious people, and they couldn't do anything but blame, you know, young women as they were growing up and like putting all the blame on their shoulders. And then next week in our next episode, we'll be talking about a very fantastical view of what that looked like. But you know,
and this week is very grounded. Next week is off the wall.
So with that, Elizabeth, what is your Stitch rating then for this film?
I think it's a solid like a solid 4.5.
Ooh, wow.
I really, really liked it.
That's
really liked
awesome.
it. I think he could have gotten like, I like didn't quite understand whether they thought the father had done something or the father like disagreed with how they were teaching the Bible and the Puritan beliefs. I was a little bit confused about that. So I wish it had gotten into that more. And really the twins just like made me so annoyed.
Elizabeth was getting ready to get into the TV and start fighting. She was like, square up.
They were so annoying.
And this is not a beef with the actual child actors. They were amazing at their jobs, actually.
Yeah.
So there should be an Oscar for like young child actors because they would have got it for me.
They absolutely would have. But Spencer, what is your Stitch rating?
So I loved this movie. I thought it was really great. I thought, you know, like I said, it was fantastic in the sense that it was like so realistic. I thought the horror was creepy. The language and the way these like actors had to like recite their lines is very poetic and beautiful. I just thought from a production design point of view, cinematography, costume, of course, the brilliant Linda Muir, I thought it was all great. And, you know, even though I also found the twins annoying, I was like, in my head, I was like, they're doing the job, though. Like, I knew like these actors were killing it because I, too, was like clenching my fists, being like, like Linda said in her interview, like, you're a mannequin. Do not speak, you know, and they weren't listening to their mom and dad.
No.
So I am going to give this, I don't know. I was trying not to go into the 0.5. So I'm also like at a 4. I guess I only reserve 5 for like the utmost favorite films, but
I don't think we've given anything a 5 yet.
I also, my thing too was the very beginning. I spent a lot of time wondering what it was the dad did, and I wish we had a little bit more dive into like the religious structure of like this Puritan community. I just was like left with like a little bit of questions there because there's such like rich storytelling that happens in this, dare I say, kind of fucked up society that this Puritan, you know, culture was living in. And I was like, I spent like the first 30 minutes of this film like Googling things. So like, what did the dad do? And it just kept being like, oh, talking about his pride and whatnot. And I was like, no. What did he do? I need to know.
Yeah.
You know?
Because he's like, I'm pretty sure he is on trial for something. But I was like, what did he do?
What did he do? Okay, but yeah. So I mean, it was otherwise a pretty perfect film. I really loved it, and I'm gonna add this to my Halloween rotation. And with that, Elizabeth, should we play our favorite game?
Yes, hit it, Daniel. The one costume to rule them all. Spencer, what was your one costume to rule them all?
This was a hard one. I think when Alinta was talking about Thomason's pink hue and how when she said the pink could kind of become red, I thought that was brilliant. Like that actually broke my brain because I was like, oh my gosh, that's saying this whole time that, you know, she is kind of transitioning into becoming a witch. We just don't really know that. Mm-hmm. I thought that was so smart. I mean, it broke my head. So that's my one costume.
I can't agree with you more, especially considering this is also my one costume to rule them all.
Yeah.
Because she is the central character, but I was kind of surprised like how much of the story took place without her even being there.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was brilliant.
Yeah.
I also like it because she's always talking about like England and basically like how much better things were in England for them. And she definitely, I think, is taking a little bit more interest and pride in her appearance than maybe the rest of her family, because she can remember when they had a little bit more status, more money, more comfort, and is trying to get that back through her clothing.
Yeah, it's really great costume, and there was just so much detail in all of the costumes. So, much like Linda, I can imagine, your favorite costume changing every time you see this film, because you might see something different. It was just a great one. Elizabeth, that brings us to the end of The Witch. I'm so glad we finally did this episode. Now we could stop talking about it every time something witchy comes up.
Yes, finally. And if you all want to tell us your one costume to rule them all, please email us at theartofcostume@gmail.com. Also, if you want to see everything we're talking to Linda about, go to youtube.com/attheartofcostume. You can listen and watch Daniel's fabulous video of all the images we used, or you can also go to our Instagram at @theartofcostumepod.
And also, I was supposed to announce this last week, but I totally forgot. So, we're trying this out. We're doing a spooky season Discord channel if you want to communicate with other costume nerds as we get through spooky season. So I'm going to put the link to that in the episode description. So we're going to test it out, see if it works. And if you all love this Discord channel, we might keep it around. And if not, it will disappear in the night sky on a broomstick until next year, perhaps. So
midnight on October 31st.
Right. And Elizabeth, what are we watching next week? It's an interesting one.
We are getting right to the heart of Puritan culture and some of the more fantastical elements that people have associated with the Salem witch trials. We are watching the TV show Salem.
Yeah. I have to tell everyone, you must watch this show. Even if you just watch the first season, you'll probably have enough to follow along with us. This series is batshit crazy. It is insane.
Yes.
And the costumes are Met Gala level sometimes in this little Salem town.
It is a show, as we said, it contains witchery, buffoonery, and a lack of common sense. So go watch it.
That is the episode summary, so I don't have to read it next week.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for listening. Until next time, costume nerds.
Everyone, have a wonderfully spooky week.